Welcome to Introduction to Peace and Conflict Studies. This is the first recording, the first lecture of this course. And I thought that War and Peace, the title of a famous novel by Leon Tolstoy, summarizes what it's about very well. Either you have war or you have peace. And at HJI, we of course are very much aware that it's not just on the battlefield, it starts within the family, in the home, and even within myself. But you should know that we are not the only ones who are aware of that. Many other people in peace studies and elsewhere are aware of that as well. So in this introduction lecture, I will give you a general overview and a very brief intro into what we will discuss in the coming weeks. So it will be very brief for every point, but it will give you an idea of how the whole thing flows, how one idea flows from one to the next and so on. And I hope it will help you having an overview of the course. So to start, I just ask a question or a few questions. Is it really worth trying to make peace? And if we can get peace, which of course there have been cases of peace in world history, but is a permanent breakthrough, not just a temporary peace possible? And ultimately, is True Parent's vision of John Il-Guk, that means peace as a kingdom of God on earth, absolute, complete peace forever, is that realistic? So peace studies have often been accused of being nice dreaming, but totally unrealistic. That leads to the next question. Is it really more unrealistic to pursue peace with lofty ideals, of course, or is it more unrealistic to try to achieve your goals through war? And for most of history, the answer seems to have been, of course, peace is nice, but realism is trying to achieve your goal through war. That achieves actual success. Dreaming of peace is never going to get you anywhere. That has, fortunately, changed little by little, starting mostly in the 18th century and most explicitly after World War II, where it became very clear that war may seem realistic immediately. If you feel confident that you're stronger than your enemy, you can just defeat him and have what you want and impose your peace. But that realistically, it's actually not true. That with every country feeling the same and having increasingly powerful weapons, achieving peace in that way is not realistic. What you achieve is a success that's temporary, and then succeeding defeats for yourself and for the world, and ultimately a total annihilation. So that is why the dream about peace has always existed. But peace studies as a concrete and realistic attempt to achieve peace, and also as an academic discipline, has really appeared after World War II and the creation of the United Nations. Now, Peace and Conflict Studies is the name of this particular course, and the Masters in Peace Studies that we have at HJI is called just Peace Studies. Practically speaking, the two are interchangeable because Peace and Conflict Studies is mostly about peace studies. And to deal with peace, you have to deal with conflicts and vice versa. So they're very similar, but there's a little different in the accent that is put on either peace or conflict. Conflict studies are mostly about war and related matters and how they relate to peace. Whereas peace studies are about peace and how it has to deal with conflict. So it's just a matter of accent, of emphasis. But it has practical consequences too. So you might wonder, why do we even make the difference? Well, conflict studies are the studies of how to deal with war and how to deal with attempts to make peace from the perspective of war. And they are generally conflict studies operated by the governments that wage war. So here you have a quote by DoD, that's the Department of Defense of the United States. Security-related research has access to funding that may not exist for research labeled as peace or peace studies. And that's very realistic. Obviously, the governments will always fund what they need in order to secure their place in a world that is always very much threatening. On the other hand, even the United States Institute for Peace, which was created by the US Congress and is funded by the US Congress, so it's as institutional as you can get it for peace studies, but still they are struggling with getting the funds they need. So that shows that peace studies is still in a more difficult position than conflict studies, because conflict studies or war studies always have the attention of governments in a way that peace studies don't. Now, this is just a brief example of two studies that are conflict studies. I mean, from that perspective, from that side of peace and conflict studies, the United States Army War College and School of Advanced Military Studies. But you can also see that, for instance, on the right, it's about peacekeeping training. So even the military, from their perspective, they are not just discussing on how we can win conflicts, but they're also very much interested in ending conflicts. Nobody more than the people who fight the battles know that conflict is costly and they want to stop. And peacekeeping is one happy activity for anybody who is in the war business. So in this course, obviously, we are going to concentrate more on the peace aspect of conflict, but we can never get away from the conflict element, because that's part of the equation. Nevertheless, in the first week after this one, I mean, it's the second week, we will look at theoreticians of war. In other words, those who throughout history have insisted that through war, you can get what you want. Not our perspective, but it's good to know. Then peace and conflict studies, or PCS, as it's often abbreviated, peace and conflict studies that have appeared after World War II have immediately appeared as a multidisciplinary discipline. And on the left here, you have a list of all the different studies that are different disciplines that are involved in peace studies. That goes from economics to theology. And many of these studies are themselves, many of these disciplines like sociology, social science, psychology, they are new themselves. To us, they are not new because we've always had them during our life, but they started really at the end of the 19th century. That means a little bit more than 100 years ago. Peace studies is even more recent. As I said, it appeared really in substance at the end of World War II and even a little bit later than that. Then the next question is, what is peace? Always, go back to the definitions when you talk about something, even if it seems obvious. So a very important insight in peace studies is that peace is, of course, first the absence of war, but it's more than the absence of war. And actually, that statement, peace is more than the absence of war, has been attributed to just about everybody, from the Pope to the George W. Bush. Everybody, maybe with some differences in formulation, has said that. So that means everybody is very much aware of it. But the first step is, of course, stop fighting. Okay, and then how can we make sure that the fighting doesn't stop again the day after tomorrow? And that includes many elements that are here listed here. And by the way, when you listen to this presentation, I don't always read everything. So if you can just pause and take your time to read and then continue. It's obvious, but just wanted to remind you. So there's a lot of contents and what peace should be: inner peace, harmonious development, social justice, fulfillment of one's potential, whatever these things mean, they are all involved. So in short, this is simplified as there's negative peace and there's positive peace. Negative doesn't mean bad peace. It means just the negation of open war. There is no war, but it could be just for a few minutes or a few days, a few years, a few days. But all the conditions for war starting again soon are still there. We still hate each other. There is no solution to the underlying causes of conflict, no resolution of anything. We still hate each other. So war is almost sure to start again very soon. But at least for now, we have war, we have peace as no fighting. On the other hand, positive peace is more than just no fighting. It's real or positive peace should also include the elements that you have listed previously and more. And the presence of social structure and also internal disposition that make lasting peace a realistic expectation. We have not only stopped fighting, but we have created circumstances that make it realistic to hope at least that peace will last. And we have this, not, of course, now with the war in Ukraine and not in the Middle East. These are discussions that are constantly there. Do we want a truce? Do we just stop fighting so that people stop dying even for a day? Or do we want to really solve this thing? And it's a back and forth. So both are needed, but ultimately positive peace is necessary. Positive peace includes a number of things, but it's also a very tricky thing to attain, as we know. As we know, that's why we're always tempted to say, okay, we can't have a real peace, but let's just stop fighting even for a day, because it's so difficult to get the real thing. Here is a very interesting insight that I wanted to share and that we'll get back to later on. The different political perspectives seem to lead either to solution through war or through real peace. Realism is the somewhat cynical perspective that, well, there is no higher purpose, there is no higher justice in this world. The only thing that we can do in order to achieve what we want is to win the war. We have to be stronger. So that's the very cynical perspective of international politics that many times prevail. They are not good to show to the people, but in reality, that's what often prevails. Liberalism, on the other hand, is the emphasis on institutions that foster peace, essentially democracy. And an author that we will discuss had a very good insight that unfortunately, many times even liberalism is enforced through ways that are not different from realism. Think of the Iraq War. The United States under President Bush attacked Iraq to impose democracy and peace. So that is exactly what many people felt is contradictory, and indeed it didn't work. You try to achieve positive peace, democracy, and people want to have peace and we solve the problems, but try to impose it through violence, which is the ways of negative peace. So even when you have an ideal and you want to impose democracy, many times it's done in a brutal way, and which leads us right back to negative peace. Critical theory is essentially Marxism, and in their case, it's obvious that violence is a key element. So to avoid this vicious circle where you try to have positive peace, but you use the means of negative peace and you never get there, there is a notion that's essential, and that's the notion of transcendence. We would see it as the transcendence of God. That means above everything there is God, and if we can achieve God's original ideal of creation, then peace will be there. We can look at things from the higher perspective and so on. Johann Galtung, who is considered the father of peace studies, we'll get to hear his name many times in the future. He himself used the introduced the transcend method, peace through transcendence, transformation of conflict through transcendence. But he didn't mean necessarily the transcendent of a religious perspective, just we have to learn to look at things not from my perspective or your perspective, but from a higher perspective. Whenever you can do that, then there's a possibility for both sides to understand each other better and to make concessions so that peace really can be achieved. So that is something that will be considered. Next is the different levels of peace. I've already mentioned that peace can sometimes last only one day. That's a truce or a ceasefire. Sometimes it lasts decades, but it's still not peace. And then you have unstable peace. That's peace there is a treaty, but there's so many internal disagreements that you never know when war will still start again. Then you have stable peace, that's better, lasting peace, and finally perpetual peace, or Chonigur. And that will be studied in another course that you will take at the beginning of this program, which is conflict analysis and transformation. I will just briefly mention it here. The very interesting thing is, however, that even the shortest peace can express human desire for permanent peace. And I'll give you an example that has become famous, but maybe you have never heard of it. In World War I, soldiers, especially French and German soldiers, were in trenches, like you have that in the picture on the top right. They spent countless months and years fighting each other without any progress. It was a war of attrition. You know, it took forever to gain a few hundred meters, and then they lost them again. And they were dying of illness, poor hygiene, even as much as from the shells of the enemy. It was a horrible war. But on Christmas of the first year of the war, when there was still some kind of a hope and they didn't hate each other yet as much as they would after, killing each other for years, on the Christmas Day, spontaneously, the two sides came out of their trenches and in some areas and started celebrating Christmas with each other. They had a Christmas tree. There are pictures of that. You can look it up. It's fascinating. And they played soccer games and exchange gifts and so on. You see the German and the British there. This was unbelievable. And not only did they stop fighting for Christmas, but they celebrated together. They showed true brotherhood. So that shows that even in the smallest spontaneous outbreak of, peace, I mean, element of peace that lasted just a day or two, there was the deeper desire for peace. Positive peace was already there very much, but it was there spontaneously, and the people were on the front line themselves. And it stopped because the headquarters on both sides didn't like that at all. They wanted to win the war. They didn't want to make peace with the enemy. So this was immediately stopped by the headquarters of the militaries on both sides. And it just remained as a reminder that peace is really everybody's deep desire. Then conflicts have a development over time that you will study in that other course on conflict analysis. Conflicts start, they grow, and they go back to resolution. Of course, the best is if they never really start, but that is usually every conflict you can study it as a latent conflict, and it breaks out, it reaches a maximum, and then goes down again until you have post-conflict peace building. Dealing with conflict has also several stages. So the first one is conflict analysis. What is the situation that could lead to a conflict? Then, based on that analysis, you try to prevent the conflict from breaking out. That's the best case scenario, of course. It never breaks out into a war. Then, if it does, then you try to manage the conflict. And unfortunately, often that management is mismanagement. That's why the conflict never stops. Then the next stage is conflict resolution. You solve the conflict one way or another. Both sides come to the conclusion that, okay, well, we will stop fighting. We want to make peace. And they accept each other's conditions. That particular conflict is resolved with a peace treaty, the end. But as long as the two sides still distrust each other and don't like each other or even hate each other, it's pretty obvious that sooner or later, maybe not this conflict, but another conflict will erupt. To avoid that, you need conflict transformation. That means, in short, the people who used to hate each other, went to war with each other, made peace, become friends, and solve all the things that could cause conflicts, and start working together, trust each other. Again, they become friends. The best example is the European Union after World War II. The countries that hate each other most, France and Germany, became the foundation for the European Union. Now, it's not perfect. It's not the King John Il-guk, but it's something that humankind had never known before. Next comes a more philosophical question, if you will. Is human conflict inevitable, or is a harmonious society possible? That goes beyond what just even the European Union achieved, which is still plagued with internal conflicts. They are just not war. The question is then, can we even hope that with human nature being what it is, we can achieve a situation with no conflict at all? And the usual answer is summarized in this quote here: conflict is inevitable. It's an inevitable aspect of human interaction. All we can do is to try to keep conflict in bounds. So basically, try to have damage control. And that is certainly not HGI's perspective or unificationist perspective. But we will discuss that in a few weeks. You will see that there are some unexpected answers to that question that we will come up with. Next is the notion of violence, which is part of all wars. Conflict can be non-violent. You can hate each other and have internal conflict, like I want to kill him, but you don't. So from Jesus' perspective, you're already a murderer, but you are not actually having conflict. But violence means you're really going at it. And the person who has created the most common uh, terminology in terms of the different types of violence is, again, Johan Galtung, the so-called father, or at least one of the founders of peace studies, and by far the most famous one. He divided violence into three types. Direct violence, that's when I punch you in the face, or I shoot you dead in war, or send you a nuclear missile your way. The second one is structural violence. It is not direct violence, but it is the existence of structures, unjust structures in society or internationally, that make violence inevitable. For instance, the big difference between rich and poor, oppression of the population. Whenever you have these conditions, violence, direct violence, may not exist right there, but it will exist sooner or later, inevitably. And actually, the oppression itself is some kind of a violence done to those who are oppressed. The third one, cultural violence, means the inability of elites to see that injustice and even violence that is done to the oppressed categories is really violence, and is not justified. And typically, the way Europeans looked at Africa, it's just black people, so it's not the same as killing each other in Europe, this kind of thing. So these are three terms that you will see many times. On the opposite side, you have nonviolence. But nonviolence itself is just whatever you do to me, I don't fight. You can kill me, I'm not going to fight. And you just let yourself die at the hands of the enemy. But there's more to that than nonviolent, than just not fighting. So that's why I put nonviolence plus. And people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi themselves have not just allowed others, they have used a certain type of nonviolent behavior to force the other side to stop its violence. So it's not just passive acceptance of violence. And Gandhi himself has said at one point that even violence is better than the nonviolence of a coward. Just, I don't fight because I don't have the courage to. So that is another key point that we will look at. Then the notion of human rights and human security will be addressed. Human rights is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, mostly created by Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of FDR. And it's a legal concept that every human being, by the simple fact of being a human being, has certain rights, the same rights that are in the Declaration of Independence of the United States, to do what you want to do, to live in peace, to have your opinions, and not to have these rights infringed upon by others. It's a legal perspective, which is very important. It's there in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, but also in the Charter, and it's generally recognized today by most people in most countries. Human security, which probably you have never heard of, goes a little bit further. It's a very interesting concept. Human security means that human rights is nice as a notion and as a legal reality. Human security means that additionally, you need to have access to all the guarantees that human rights give you. And that's not the same. One of the human rights is the right to health and universal health care. That's listed as a human right. But if the next hospital is 500 miles away and you cannot reach it. And even if you do, there's no doctors there because they all have been killed by guerrilla fighters or the government. Then you have the human right to healthcare, but you certainly do not have healthcare as a human security. So it's a question of rights versus actual availability that will be dealt with. Then the notion of social justice. That is a very tricky one because, especially as unificationists, we are trained to believe in the importance of human action, human activity, or what humans can do, not just changing social structures. You know, that's the communists do that. They make a revolution and then they impose other social structures which are usually even worse than the previous one. Real peace is through what human beings can freely do. However, the notion of social justice is still very important, and human agency is what can create social justice. So again, it's two aspects of the same thing. The question is, which one do you emphasize first? And we'll discuss that. I will for once read what is written here. The concept of social justice first surfaced in Western thought and political language in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and the parallel development of the socialist doctrine. So it started with the left. Following the revolutions that shook Europe in the mid-1800s, social justice became a rallying cry for progressive Marxist thinkers and political activists. By the way, this is a text produced by ECOSOC by the United Nations. Social justice became more clearly defined when a distinction was drawn between the social sphere and the economic sphere and grew into a mainstream preoccupation. Here you have the factories of the 19th century where children had to work nonstop, no vacation, 15 hours a day. We all know that. And as unificationists, we all know this is not the way it should be. If there is a problem with the attempts to change that, it will be with the means and the perspective, how revolutionary people, communists, have tried to do it, but that it needs to be changed. We are in total agreement with that, and we are not the only one. So there's been some kind of a general mainstream concern about these conditions at the time in Europe, especially, that the rest of the world, there was no concern even for that, unfortunately. So a number of economists became convinced that it was their duty not only to describe these phenomena, but also to propose criteria for the distribution of the fruits of human activity. That means just criteria by economists who are mostly liberal or conservative economists, not just by Marxists. So there was a mainstream concern that started to develop about social justice. Now, the crowning achievement in a very negative sense of conflict is war. War has something very special about it compared to all other conflicts, starting with me punching you in the face and, and the mafia organizing murder and things like that. War is the war waged by sovereign nation states with nobody to do anything about it. And war, so the dimensions of war are completely different. If you take again the World War II and you compare it with me freaking out and punching you in the face, I will never do that, by the way, but I mean, just as an example, the dimensions are completely different, and war is very difficult to stop. So please read that definition of war, pause and read it. And there are rules of engagement, It ends with formal agreements. It starts with a declaration of war, usually. All these things are involved. So there are many different elements that we will consider. There's also something interesting about the word war. It's also sometimes used in a very positive way. So you have the Salvation Army, war armies, the war on terror. And then in our unification movement, you have this holy song, Marching on Heavenly Soldiers, and One World Crusade. These were the team of witnessing teams that we had. So many times people fighting for peace use the word war or army or fighting themselves. The question is just, do we do it in the right way that really will bring to peace? Can we also get rid completely of that notion of fighting, even for peace? Or do we sometimes fight for peace or fight against terror in a way that multiplies terror? So these are questions that I'm just asking now. You can think about them, and we will, keep thinking about that throughout the course and even the program. Now, again, what's in the name? Sometimes people also use war or use non-war expressions to speak about what actually really is war. And one of the best recent example is the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. It's, for all practical purpose, it's a full-scale war. But that war doesn't sound good, and I'll explain why. So you have these euphemisms, if you will. On the other hand, sometimes war is used in a way that is meant to be positive, wars of liberation. And when you hear the word war of liberation, you probably think, especially the older ones among us, we think of all the war that the former Soviet Union created in Africa, pushing the populations to fight against the European oppressors, but to create communist dictatorships that were even worse and even more oppressed by the Soviets than they were by the colonizers. And many other times, a war of liberation is a war by the population against an oppressive government, and many times it ends with a government that's even more oppressive, because what you do with violence rarely leads to peace, even if it's apparently justified. So many times when you hear war of liberation, we have a kind of not so good feeling. Just remember, however, especially the Americans among you, that the United States itself started with a war of liberation. The, war that the US colonies fought against the British Empire. So we should also not be too quick to say, oh, war of liberation is bad. Everything war is bad. So I don't mean by saying this to do a ping pong in your mind and make you completely confused. Just want to show you in this brief overview that there's so many different aspects to everything. That leads us to the notion of just war. Why was the American War of Liberation, the Independence War, why a war of independence? Why would that have been a just war compared to others? That is history. I mean, the notion of just war is a long history, mostly starting with St. Augustine, and we will have an entire week to deal with that. The question is always, what are the conditions that make a war, which is fundamentally very undesirable, acceptable in last resort? In the contemporary world of the United Nations, there is another concept that came up, the responsibility to protect. And that is, again, a very interesting concept. It's an official statement by the United Nations. So it's more than a statement. It was accepted as a project. It's called the Responsibility to Protect, or R2P in short. It means in some cases, nations that are powerful and could intervene to stop a war are responsible not for starting the war, but for not intervening militarily. The most famous example is the civil war in Rwanda, where the French had their military ready and they could have intervened easily. They were so much more powerful. They didn't do it. So that we will study also. I'm coming to the end of this presentation, and it is about what are the odds in peacemaking? Why is it so difficult? We have already had some elements of answers, but essentially, everything that's about war has the power of the governments behind them. So there are very good, important, fantastic treatises on how to do war well, how to wage war well. We'll look at this next week. These have the support of the government automatically. On the other hand, any effort towards peace, we'll see Kant's Perpetual Peace and the Red Cross that was founded by Henri Dunant. These are private undertakings. They have no support from the governments. It's kind of really starting from a very weak position, as the position of the underdog, who is really just having himself and a few people who think the same to try to make peace. That's how peace studies have started. And there is a very simple reason to that. There may be other reasons. It is national sovereignty. Think of a nation, any nation, and here I just gave examples of a few national flags randomly chosen. Inside a country, there will be conflicts, but there is rule of law. If it's a country, that is democratic government, there is rule of law, and even though people can break that rule and commit crimes, there is the power of the government there to stop it. Not always well, not always fairly, etc. This crime continues to happen, but there is the fundamental rule of law that limits and can be also to arbitrate conflicts. If I fight with my neighbor, well, if it gets out of hand, the justice system, first the police and then the justice system will come in and arbitrate and make sure that this conflict is solved. So the fundamental point is there is a sovereignty at the top that can at least try to keep the peace under its sovereignty. That means inside that country. On the world level, as we all know, there is no world sovereignty. The only sovereignty on the world level is God, who has no hands to intervene, and an ideal, the ideal that we are all one humankind, the ideal defended by the United Nations and by many other people, the concept. So it's a concept and ideal, but there is no enforcement possible because the United Nations, which would be in that position, doesn't have the power to enforce its decision, mostly, very limited and very indirect. So that is why it's always been so difficult and why peace studies have only begun to really exist and to get some kind of support even in the general population, and to be able to start doing things concretely that increase the chance for peace to happen, only since World War II, when it became obvious that the other way will lead to the end of humankind. So that concludes my first presentation, and next week we will start with one after the other all these different points that I've introduced today.